The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 16th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. Then Jesus said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was squandering his property. So he summoned him and said to him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give me an accounting of your management, because you cannot be my manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What will I do, now that my master has taken the position away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am dismissed as manager, people may welcome me into their homes.' So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil.' He said to him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly and make it 50. Then he asked another, 'And how much do you owe?' He replied, 100 containers of wheat.' He said to him, 'Take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." The Gospel of the Lord. So a couple of years ago, one of my pastor friends suffered a really horrible tragedy in her life. She came home and she found that her husband had taken his life. He probably suffered from undiagnosed depression, but there were no signs, and that simply added to the shock and the tragedy of the whole event. And as the weeks and months went on and she was dealing with the tragedy and the grief in her life, she adopted a motto, which she frequently posted on Facebook. In fact, she still sometimes posts this on Facebook. Her motto is, "Embrace the suck." Embrace the suck. And we all kind of knew what she meant by that. But as the months rolled along and we watched how she lived and we listened to her talk about that, it was clear that embrace the suck did not mean love the suck. It did not mean enjoy the suck. It didn't mean wallow in the suck. It meant rather that she needed to deeply and fully accept that this is the way life is, even though it sucks. And for my friend, and for many other people, that's actually an important thing to do. And that's because, perhaps counterintuitively, it's often only by embracing the suck that you can begin to see the possibility of new life beyond the suck, even if that life is going to be different from the way you had envisioned it before. It's only by embracing the suck that you can begin to accept and see possibilities that you just couldn't when you were hoping that things would just go back to the way they used to be. And it's often only by embracing the suck that you have the strength and the courage to actually take the steps and to live into that new way. But all of those things are really hard to do, especially when you have to do them quickly and subtly. So I thought about my friend as I was reading today's gospel reading and getting ready for this weekend, because Jesus tells a story about a guy who has to suddenly and unexpectedly embrace the suck. Now, to be sure, this parable is a weird one. All kinds of weird stuff going on here. The guy in the story is a financial manager who is accused of cooking the books. And so he gets fired. But unlike today, when you would be summarily walked out of the office having had your passwords first changed, he's not. He's got a little bit of time. Very little. And he uses that little bit of time to, frankly, justify the boss's concern. He cooks the books some more. And at the end of the story, this really strange thing happens. The boss commends the guy for being shrewd. I mean, why? Is the boss happy about losing even more money? So, the important thing about parables is, don't push the analogy too far. And remember that this is not a real story. This is a story Jesus makes up to make a point. And the point is that this financial manager knows how to embrace the suck. That's actually a really good definition of the Greek word that's translated as shrewd. This manager embraces the suck by accepting that life has changed in a really bad way for him. He doesn't waste time with denial or bargaining. Instead, he knows that life is never going to go back to the way it was. And that allows him to see possibilities that he had not even considered before, even though, in fact, these possibilities are probably illegal possibilities. Still, he sees those possibilities, and because he knows that the time is short, he wastes no time in living into those new possibilities. So why does Jesus tell us this parable? I mean, it's certainly not because he wants us to cook the books for the organizations for which we work, and it's important that you know that I'm not cooking the books because I read this parable. And it's not because Jesus asks us to go and do dishonest things. But Jesus is saying this while he's on the road to Jerusalem. He's on the way to the cross. Things are about to get really sucky, really fast. And even though many of the people following Jesus thought that following him would just be a wonderful, fun trip full of sweetness and light, it wasn't going to be that way. At least not all the time. Sometimes following Jesus would be hard, because sometimes following faithfully is hard and painful and leads you into hard and painful situations. And sometimes that's just the way life is. Life is hard and painful, and following Jesus does not insulate you from that reality. So in some ways, Jesus is using this parable to say to us, look, you know how even dishonest and unfaithful people know how to embrace the suck in their life when they need to. You people, as my followers, should be able to do the same thing. But even when I know I have to, I don't want to embrace the suck in my life. I resist it. Probably you do too. And if we need encouragement to do that, we probably just need a good psychologist. I don't really need Jesus to tell me that. So I want to ask Jesus, why are you really telling me this? I mean, what good is it to know this? And if I'm going to have to embrace the suck in my life anyway, how is it that you're making a difference in my life? And maybe the difference is this. At least for me, embracing the suck is more possible in my life when I have reason to be confident that there really is life beyond the suck, both for me and for others. Jesus is leading his disciples on the road to the cross, but it doesn't end there. And Jesus' disciples probably remember this parable because they remember that even as bad as things got, God was providing life beyond that time. And it wasn't just life in heaven someday after they die. They had life next week, next month, next year. That was full of hope and promise and possibility for them in ways that they had not imagined. And I will say that in my life, at the times that I've had to embrace the suck, sometimes I'm able to more fully do that again because I have actually experienced that there is actually life beyond that. And that God is providing another opportunity next week, next month, next year, even if it's very, very different than what I am used to envision. Having Jesus in my life helps me to embrace the suck because I can more readily do that when I have reason to believe that there are new possibilities God is placing before me, even if I can't see them right at the moment. And some of the reasons that I can't see them right at the moment is I desperately want things to go back the way they were, because I knew how to deal with things the way they were. But when I realize and actually embrace the fact that it's not going to be like that, sometimes I'm able to see things that were there all along that God was putting in front of me that I didn't want to see before, or that I just couldn't see before. And I think that's the way it was for Jesus' first disciples. They wanted to keep following Jesus like puppy dogs as as they followed him around to village to village, and then after the resurrection, he's alive again, and they went, great, let's go back to the way things were. And he went, no. We have new ways of following. And they started to find new ways of following Jesus, new ways of living as his people. But it was different than it was before. And in some ways, in some respects, the things that Jesus was calling them to do and the ways that they were going to live were the ways that he had always been telling them to live. They just couldn't see it while Jesus was right there in front of them. That's what maybe Jesus is calling us to do in this parable, is to look for those new ways that God's putting in front of us. And for me too, learning to embrace the suck is more possible when I know that I don't have to walk into the future by myself. Jesus' first disciples figured out that Jesus was always there walking with them, even if they couldn't see him right in front of their face. They remembered words that Jesus said, like, I'm with you always to the end of the age, not just in heaven someday when you get there, because they experienced in their lives that Jesus actually was walking with them. He was walking with them spiritually. He was walking with them in the lives of fellow believers. They didn't have to do it alone. And what Jesus is calling us to see, I think, in this parable, is to know that when we have to face those difficult times in our lives, that we don't have to do it alone. Jesus tells us this parable for lots of reasons, but mostly to remind us that, following Jesus does not exempt us from pain and tragedy. It doesn't make our lives easier, and it's not a great big aspirin for those times when we just got to embrace the suck. But following Jesus does ground us in the transcendent reality of God's love and presence, which promises us that the suck is not the end for us, for those we love, or for the world around us. Jesus promises us that there is hope and new life for us, both in this world and in the world to come. Jesus promises us that God is always placing new ways forward in front of us, even when they mean living differently than we had ever imagined before. And Jesus promises us that he's going to be there walking with us in all of those new ways. And for me, those are the things that really matter. Those are the things that can give us strength and courage at those times in our lives when, like my friend, we just got to embrace the sun.